Well, hello, happy Wednesday to you. We continue our pastor's devotional series, thinking about the word justice today, inspired by the life of John Lewis, great Congressman, Civil Rights worker, his entire life. And I was just, as I was watching memorial services and watching those things about him and his life, was reminded time and time again that so many of the folks on the front lines of the civil rights movement were biblically educated, theologically educated. So many of the gatherings and meetings were Christian-based and oriented. And so what I thought that we would do this week is just pick out some different scriptures that were used throughout much of the civil rights movement and see sort of where those came from, what the original intent was, and why civil rights leaders were inspired to use them. So today we are going to look at maybe the most famous one of all of the passages that have the word justice or that are used in justice movements, and that comes from the book of Amos, chapter 5. Now, I'm going to give you a second to find the book of Amos. It's not the easiest to find. It's just about 4 or 5 pages. So go flip through, find it. It is almost to the New Testament. So if you get to the Gospel of Matthew and you just go back maybe 10, 20 pages, you're going to end up in Amos. Now, I wish we could just read the whole thing. It's powerful. But what I want to do is I want to read a passage that is very famous. You'll be familiar with it. Then I want to share the setting that Amos was written in, and you can see, you'll be able to see why it was written then and why it's such a powerful passage to continue using. So, Amos chapter 5. I'm going to start at verse 21, Amos 5:21. This is the prophet speaking, and remember, prophets speak the voice of God. So the I in this passage is theoretically God speaking. I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the offerings of well-being of your fatted animals, I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. But let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. This passage was used by Martin Luther King Jr. in his I Have a Dream speech. And it has been used time and time and time again. This passage was used at John Lewis's funeral service by Reverend Bernice King, Martin Luther King Jr.'s daughter, in her invocation, in her prayer. Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Powerful words that have been used many, many times throughout the years. So let's look at this whole passage. It starts pretty bleak, doesn't it? God saying, I despise your festivals. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. I don't want the burnt offerings. I don't want the grain offerings. I don't want the money offerings. Take your noise of your songs away from me. I won't listen to your harps anymore. God is angry, it sounds like. I mean, it essentially, think of everything that we might do in a worship service. We're singing, we're making offerings, it's a celebration sometimes. Sometimes it's more solemn. God doesn't want any of that, God says in this passage. Instead, what God wants to happen is for justice to roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. It seems like the situation was extreme, was dire, and it was. So let me give you the background of the book of Amos. So Amos is he's a herdsman, a peasant, and he's called as a prophet by God. So he's from the lower class of people, and he's called to be a prophet by God. And he's called to be a prophet. This is pre Jesus, obviously, because we're in the Old Testament. So it is during a time in which Israel has risen in power, and they have kicked out anybody who was ruling in the promised land. They've even gone to war, and they've taken over a number of sort of neighboring tribes, countries. This is probably the wealthiest, most powerful time in Israel's history, maybe ever. And what has happened is there has become a sort of wealthy ruling class that is enjoying the benefits of power, and they are enjoying the benefits of power at the to the detriment of many others. So if you read through all of the book of Amos, what you will see are these things. You'll see that there was corruption in the courts that kept poor people poor, and that kept imprisoned people in prison. That they were creating, the rich were creating these large estates, and essentially enslaving the small landowners. And so they would take over these huge swaths of land, the rich would, land that was owned by someone else, and essentially the owners, those poor farmers, would just become slaves to these wealthy. They were degrading the needy. They were charging high prices for basic commodities. They were demanding costly offerings and sacrifices for the worship of God. So the rich are getting richer. They're very powerful. They have this ruling class. And the high priests were also getting very wealthy, and they were participating alongside of the ruling class, that the religious leaders became a part of this ruling class. And then, and that was the highest levels of the religious leaders. But the rest of the religious leaders, sort of underneath them, kind of turned their back on the people, and they didn't critique it. They didn't talk about the poor and the needy. They just participated in the wealth and the power. And the prophet comes along, and he begins pointing out their sinfulness, and he begins warning them that if Israel doesn't change, that it's going to go down in flames. And that's exactly what happens. 40 years after the writing of Amos, Israel is overtaken, and all of that wealth and all of that power is wiped out. And the prophet says, God is going to allow that to happen if you don't change your ways. And rather, the prophet says, the best religious ways are not by these big festivals and how much money you can give, and giving all of your healthy animals to sacrifice. It's not all the assemblies. It's none of that. True religion that needed to be focused on, said the prophet, is religion that lets justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Justice, so justice, doing right for other people. And of course, righteousness means doing right by God. That we ought to do right by God, and justice to do right by other people. That wasn't happening. And the prophet is calling out for that to happen. And all these years later, the civil rights movement picks up this refrain. A refrain that asks us to do right by God and to do right by others. And still, all of these years later, the Christian church, we still are seeking ways to do right by God and to do right by others. May your day be filled with that search. God bless.